Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank you all for coming out this afternoon to join us here at the Asan Institute. I want to thank the Asan Institute for providing this platform for me to speak about my country, South Africa. And especially I'd like to thank EBS for creating a channel to the broader Korean society. I am Hilton Anthony Dennis, the ambassador of South Africa to Korea.
Asan wene, Asan wene, Asan wene mana, Asan wene, Asan wene, Asan wene, Asan wene mana. Injaloyo, makalabo, makalabo zuwe, makalabo zuwe, makalabo, makalabo, makalabo zuwe, makalabo, makalabo zuwe, makalabo.
Now, the story of every country is the story about the people of that country. Where do they come from? Why did they choose to live in a particular geographical space? How did they survive in that space? How did they create successful socio-economic systems or material culture? I've often wondered myself about the Korean people. Why did they choose to live in this area that has 70% of the territory covered in mountains? Such a harsh environment, extremely cold winters, minus 20 degrees. I'm here 4 years and I haven't quite coped with that. The summers on the other extremes. I've been in Daegu in summer and it was 40 degrees and humid. Such an extreme climate. I wonder how people survived here before the advent of air conditioning. But somehow the Korean people mastered this environment and went beyond that and created a very successful civilization that survived for 5,000 years. That is an interesting story, I think. So too, I hope I can interest you in the history of the people of South Africa. So the story of the people of South Africa begins in Africa. And the story is an old one, because I am not sure how many of you are aware that actually the science of anthropology accepts as fact that humankind arose in Africa and from that base then migrated to other parts of the world. Out of Africa, 7 million years ago, man moved first to Southeast Asia, to Europe, and beyond, and populated the whole world. So the evidence for this lies in fossils that have been found in South Africa, in Kenya, and in Ethiopia. If you visit South Africa, there's a World Heritage Site. It's a working archaeological site called the Cradle of Mankind, Morapen. If you ever visit South Africa, please make sure that you visit this place. So the first peoples of the world arose out of Africa. And of course, these were hunter-gatherers, and they moved freely across the continent. there were no borders in those idyllic days. The first peoples of South Africa then are what is called the Khoisan people. These are a Stone Age people. There are some remnants of them who still survive today in South Africa. But if you look very closely at these people, don't they look very much like Korean people? They do. These are some of the first peoples of the world. They live now, very few of them, a few thousand of them, in a desert in South Africa. But most of them have been absorbed into the mainstream of our society. The second big story I want to tell you about Africa is beyond the Stone Age. Africa is known today for the Great Sahara Desert, which is that light brown area at the top there. But 6,000 years ago, the whole of Africa was just a lush green countryside. There was no desert. History says there was a big event that caused climate change in Africa. So climate change is not a new thing. There's evidence of it taking place 6,000 years ago in Africa. And the desert then gradually expanded. And the people who were living in this area then got into a competition over resources. And this triggered another big migration of people, a really epic story. And many of you who are students might take an interest in this one day. There's a peoples of Africa called the Bantu people who lived in this area here, north central Africa. And because of the expanding desert, they moved down to the south of Africa in 3 columns. One down the east coast, another one down the west coast, and another one down the center of Africa. These are called the Bantu people. Bantu is just an anthropological name. The evidence for this migration lies in a common root to the language spoken by the peoples of southern Africa, east, central, north, west of Africa, the Bantu language. The other evidence also is the pottery that is used by many of these people. So these are the second people of South Africa. I'm not sure whether many of you are aware that South Africa is a major wine producer in the world today. And I'll tell you a quick story about the wine industry, that it's divided into old world wines and new world wines. South Africa is in the category of new world wines with, who are the other wine producers? Chile, USA, Australia, Argentina. But what many people don't know is that South Africa is the oldest of the New World wine producers, because that wine-making culture was brought by the Afrikaner people in about 1660 to South Africa. It's an interesting story how this wine industry started, because this was during the period of the Reformation in Europe. And many Protestants from the Bordeaux region of France, which is the best wine growing area, those people were called the Huguenots. They fled France for religious reasons, settled in Holland, and then traveled as settlers to South Africa. They found the climate perfect for wine growing, and they started the industry. So the wine industry in South Africa was started by the best wine growers of the time. So it's a center of excellence, and we are a major wine exporter today. The Dutch, because as I told you, their main base in Asia was in Indonesia, Malaysia. They called it the Batavian Republic. They brought out slaves from Malaysia, Indonesia, to work in their houses and in the fields in the Cape Town area. Today, these people of Malaysian origin constitute 3% of our population. By the year 1838, South Africa actually consisted of 4 states. As Korea has a history of the 3 kingdoms before you unified into one, we had 4 states. Because after the Napoleonic Wars in Europe around 1790s, the Dutch sided with the French, and the British then prevailed, and the British became the new global power in the world, and they took over the possessions, many French, Dutch possessions around the world, including their colony in Cape Town. So in around 1798 and in 1806, Cape Town came under the control of the British. These Afrikaner people then moved into the inland of the country and established 2 republics called the Transvaal and the Free State. And these 2 provinces were colonies of Britain. We then, during this time, this province in the eastern coast, and by the way, that is my home province, called KwaZulu-Natal, it has a subtropical climate, very much like Jeju Island. So when I'm in Jeju, I feel like I'm at home. Just a lovely, pleasant climate. But sugarcane grows very well over here. And so the British, who had colonized that area, brought workers out from India to work in the sugarcane fields. And so we have a big Indian population in South Africa. It's the biggest Indian population outside of India. Mahatma Gandhi, if amongst you are students of history, the founding father of modern India, lived for 25 years in South Africa. We always tease the Indian people that they gave us a lawyer because he came to South Africa as a lawyer, but he learned his politics in South Africa, and when he went back, he was a fully fledged politician. So they gave us a lawyer and we gave them back a politician. So South Africa then has a very, very diverse population. By 1909, South Africa was unified into what is called the Union of South Africa. But just very briefly, what inspired that is around 1865 and then later in 1888 was a big diamond find and a gold find in this area of the country. So this was the biggest vault of diamonds ever found in the world to date. The biggest vault of gold discovered anywhere in the world. They're still mining it to this day. That's why South Africa has some of the deepest mines in the world today. It's a huge vault of gold. And of course, where there are riches involved, you get a lot of predatory behavior. In the end, there were wars here, and the British then prevailed over those Afrikaner republics, and they unified, they consolidated those 4 states into one state, the Union of South Africa. The biggest flaw of that arrangement was that it was a product of colonialism, white rule. So it was a state controlled in the interest of white people. The African majority were used as cheap labor and completely marginalized in the country of their birth. That was the biggest weakness. But that period of 1860 to around this time also saw the huge industrialization of South Africa. Because with all these mines in the interior, there were railway lines built from the coast to the interior. Engineers came out, and already 1880, 1890, South Africa was well on the way to industrialization. The biggest achievement of this union was that it made South Africa an industrialized country. When it reached its high point around 1970, South Africa was one of the top 10 leading economies in the world. There was a study done that the white people of South Africa had the second highest living standard in the world after the people of the state of California in the U.S., not just the whole of the U.S., but the most prosperous state in the U.S. This was a center of science, technology. The first heart transplant in the world took place in South Africa in 1968. The center of the diamond industry, I should tell you, in a place called Kimberley, got electrical street lights before the city of London. It was just a center of wealth. So there's a whole social, economic transformation that took place. And but the basic flaw in the whole system was that it was a perfection of the system of colonialism. It was called apartheid, which meant minority rule, minority white rule. So you had all the worst elements of racism, segregation. White people and black people could not mix either at schools or in residential areas. The system was called apartheid. And of course, a minority cannot rule over a majority with soft gloves, so it became a security state. And at some point, the United Nations declared it a crime against humanity, and it became unsustainable. The point is, a system like this cannot prevail without resistance. And sure enough, in South Africa, like everywhere else in the world, resistance arose against this system of colonialism. I think the people of Asia can relate completely to what I am saying, because you too were all colonized at some point. But the resistance against colonialism since 1652 first took the form of conventional types of fighting using traditional weapons of spears and spears and shields. And of course, European military technology was much more advanced than what we had at that time, so they prevailed. And that's exactly what happened in Asia too. They had superior technology and just prevailed. The last of this kind of battle, there were many battles over 100 years, but the last kind of traditional battle took place in around 1901. Thereafter, the resistance to colonialism and apartheid took over modern forms of resistance. For example, we already had many black people who had gone to study in the USA, who had gone to study in Britain and had come back. Others were priests, others were journalists. They started writing letters to the government complaining about this or that, organizing demonstrations, modern forms of struggle. There was already trade union movements that were being formed in the industrial centers of South Africa. So the first thing was that the liberation movement formed an organization in 1912 to resist colonialism and apartheid and to advance the interests of the African people. This organization was formed in 1912 and it still exists today, over 100 years old. Today it's the ruling party in South Africa. But you asked me the question, how many organizations can survive for so long? And so this liberation movement has a long history of democracy since 1912. I've just listed there the presidents of this organization over a 100-year period. So the point is that democracy is well rooted within the liberation movement in South Africa. These are the kind of struggles that took place. This is a march in 1955 where the women of South Africa protested. This demonstration took place on the 9th of August in 1955. 1955. Today, 9th of August is a public holiday in South Africa declared as Women's Day to commemorate this event. I think everyone knows Nelson Mandela. He went to prison for over 27 years fighting for these ideals. But I emphasize the point that Nelson Mandela himself was shaped by the thinking of the liberation movement, and he was such a great individual that he left a legacy himself. But many people don't know that sitting next to Nelson Mandela on Robben Island, the prison, was a South African of Indian origin who also spent 27 years in jail. There are other South Africans of white origin who spent 15 years in jail fighting against that system. Others spent many years in exile. So these things that we talk about and we hold dear in South Africa, democracy, non-racism, non-sexism, are ideals that have been fought for and struggled for over a long period of time and are deeply rooted. On the 27th of April 1994, we had our first democratic election, and that's when Nelson Mandela became president. And the core ethos of our constitution, which scholars of constitutional law tell us is one of the most liberal in the world. But the core value to it is non-racial, non-sexist, democratic state. And as I've tried to demonstrate to you that these values are deeply rooted in South Africa. And that's why we believe that these ideas like democracy, you can't impose them on another people. People must absorb them, fight for them, root them themselves. And then they become living ideas. There's nothing that triggers South Africans more to go out to the barricades like any hint of a threat against democracy. So it's very real. It's a valued tradition. Lastly, the logo of the democratic South Africa has an inscription here, and it's in a language that's no longer spoken. Kli iklara kli. I wonder if any one of you could even try that. Can you say kli iklara kli? Yeah, it's not that easy. That's the language of the Khoisan people, the first peoples of South Africa. In the olden days in South Africa, it was a very Eurocentric tradition of looking for Latin inscriptions. But we took the language of the first peoples of South Africa. What that means is unity in diversity. That's what we think of ourselves. And we call our people the Rainbow Nation. So we are not a country like yourselves. When I look at you, you all look like Koreans. But you can see we are just a diverse people. So today the world talks about multiculturalism. We talk about non-racism. But I think South Africa is a living experiment, which I think will be very illustrative to many parts of the world. Because one of the consequences of globalization is people migrating all around the world. Even Korea today is grappling with the idea of multiculturalism, and many societies in the world are doing it. We've been doing it now for 20 years, managing a multicultural society, diverse society, on the principles that I've just described. Many people have said that it wouldn't work, but it's 20 years, it's still working. So maybe there's something correct that is happening in Africa, southern tip of Africa, and students of constitutional law, political science, I think would do well to have a look at that example. I want to rush ahead. I have taken a very big interest in King Sejong the Great, real philosopher king. There are some words that I read of his that struck a chord in me, where he said, I dream that my people, the Korean people, live in peace and harmony, that they be a springboard for a new culture, a new civilization, that you not just copy other people, but be a source of an original culture. He had a profound vision, and I think it is that guided him in the great achievements of his period, Hangul, the language. I saw there was a book written on scientific agriculture already in his period. For me, an epitome of a wise philosopher king. Chief Albert Luthuli was such a person. If you read his writings now, 50 years later, and you read the constitution of the new South Africa, you wonder, how can a person who lives in such a difficult condition have a vision so powerful, so clear, that he can visualize what his country can be in its diversity. So that is why I like King Sejong the Great, because I see him as a founding father of the nation, of the Korean people and the state. I want to rush ahead also. Admiral Lee Yun-shin, the warrior leader of the Korean people. I know the great story. And I like him so much because he reminds me so much of Nelson Mandela, a real warrior. Can you imagine, in the 60s, South Africa was one of the 10 biggest economies in the world. South Africa was a leading manufacturer in the arms industry. South Africa had nuclear weapons, very powerful, manufactured helicopters and fighter planes. And he was running a small organization, but many people came to him and said, "You'll never win. This force is too powerful. Just give up. You're a lawyer, make money and enjoy yourself." And I remember the story of Admiral Lee Sun Shin when he only had 24 ships left and they said, "Give up." But he soldiered on and prevailed. So these are warriors, founding fathers of nations. Today, 2014, we had our first democratic election, 1994. So it's 20 years. In South Africa, we are now celebrating 20 years of freedom and democracy. We've made many advances. 80% of our people have got better access to basic services like electricity, like housing, like healthcare. So life has changed in a real and material way for the majority of the people of South Africa. Of course, we have our problems, but tell me which country in the world doesn't have problems. We come from a very, very difficult background. We've managed to overcome those peacefully, and we are confident of the future. 20 years is almost the length of our bilateral relations between South Africa and Korea. Our diplomatic relations are 22 years old. I'd like just to say in conclusion a few words about Korea-South Africa relations. You know that South Africa fought in the Korean War, and that was the first real contact between South Africans and Korea. But our diplomatic relations were only established in 1992. So off that foundation, we have been building a bilateral relation to the point where South Africa is Korea's #1 trading partner in Africa, and Korea is South Africa's #4 trading partner in Asia. So I believe we are important to each other. We need now also to improve our people-to-people relationship, and I do hope more Korean people visit South Africa. We are getting over 3,500 tourists a month, but we think it can increase. So allow me just in conclusion to show you a few of the things that I think the Korean people might find interesting in South Africa. We have some of the best golf courses in the world. It's no mistake that we produce world champions in golf, like Ernie Els and many others. We have some of the most exciting holiday resorts where you can go out and just have a mixed bag of entertainment out in a very secluded part of the country. Enjoy our wines. There's a wine route where you can stay in this region and travel from one estate to the other, tasting wines every day. I'm sure the students will enjoy that. You just taste wine every single day. And after 7 days, you can't remember what you did on the first day. So this is just some of the scenery in some of the wine estates. You will recall that I told you that we are at the halfway point, Asia and Europe. But the thing about where we are in the Cape is right at the confluence of two major oceans of the world. You have the Indian Ocean on this side and the Atlantic Ocean on that side. So that creates a very unique kind of environment. This is the famous Cape of Good Hope, the most southern tip around which the ships sail, which is said to be where the two oceans meet. But this creates a very good environment for the animals of the ocean. So we have tourist attractions where you can go down in a cage and play with the shark. So some of you look very brave. You put your hand out and you play with its nose, and it makes a lunge for you. You can swim with the dolphins, dancing with the dolphins. I'm sure the young ladies will like this. Penguins like that area of the Cape of Good Hope, and you can go and watch the penguins and even play with them. You pick them up and pet them. Whales, the whales come in a certain area in South Africa called Hermanus, and they spawn there every year. It's about a 2-month period between September and October. And you can stand on the land, and just maybe 50 meters out, you see these huge whales just playing in the ocean. Great sights. We have the biggest and I think the best game reserves in the world. Kruger National Park is where animals just walk around in their natural habitat. It's the biggest game reserve in the world. It's as big as the state of Belgium in Europe. And so you can take a safari in South Africa. Young honeymoon couples, I think this is something very new, to go on honeymoon. And then the famous Cape Town. This Cape Town, together with Jeju Island, is declared one of the new 7 natural wonders of the world. This is our major tourist attraction. And I'm sure many of you will feel most welcome there. Because of our diverse population, our food is very cosmopolitan. So it's a little bit of everywhere around the world, and that's one of the benefits of coming from a diverse society. Thank you very much. Kamsahamnida. I hope that I've given you some sense about my country. Thank you very much. Yes, I'm eager and willing to take some questions, so no questions?
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. It's interesting. I just got to know that there are different communities living together in South Africa. And I'm curious, what can we learn, as Koreans, what can we learn from South Africa? Because now our country is becoming diverse, and at some point we have to deal with unification with North Korea. So what are some of your insights? That will be my question.
Well, it's not for me to say what you can learn from us, but all I can do is tell you what we have done, and whatever you think is useful for yourselves, you can take that up. But I'll give you an example, that when South Africa unified, we kept the parliament down in Cape Town, and the administrative center where government sits is in Pretoria, and where the judiciary sits is in Bloemfontein, another part of the country. And this was done at the time of the unification of those 4 states into the Union of South Africa, so that each capital didn't feel excluded. So at the end, you have a union, but without one part dominating the other. I've often thought about one day North Korea unifies with South Korea. South Korea is strong. North Korea maybe not so strong. So North Korea is going to be worried that South Korea is going to dominate you completely. So it will be a very strong gesture if the South says, okay, let's keep parliament in Pyongyang and we'll keep the government in the South. An example. You are a very homogeneous society. I know Korea talks about multiculturalism, but it's a very small, almost marginal minority of people who are now living in Korea who come from outside. If I remember the statistics well, there might be about 1 million foreigners living in Korea and a few others who have become indigenized. So you talk about a multicultural society. We have got significant minorities. I demonstrated to you that our European population is about 8 or 9% of total population. That translates into numbers of about 4.5 million. Now that's the population of, it's bigger than the population of Singapore, for sure. It's a huge population. The Indian population is about 3 million. Malay, Indonesian now is about 2.5 million. And these people have lived in South Africa for over 300 years. They know no other country. South Africa is home. The majority of the people are the indigenous Bantu people, the African people. So our view is that we are a non-racial, non-sexist, democratic state without one culture dominating the other. When Nelson Mandela went to prison, very famous words that he said. He said, I fought against white domination and I have fought against black domination. These ideals I'm willing to struggle and fight for, but if need be, I'm willing to die for them. People never understood what he meant when he said, he's an African person and he says, I'm fighting against black domination. What he meant is that you could have a society without one culture dominating the other. So you have a free exercise of will. You can retain your culture, but don't stop anyone who likes something in your culture to absorb it. So you can flourish in a non-racial, non-cultural environment. I think the issue here is in future in the world, if this is the consequence of globalization, can we really be talking about a nation state? Because since the Westphalian Treaty of 1648 in Europe, central to the state became the nation. And the classical theory about the nation is that you had a common language, common ethnicity, common religion. These are the things that made you a nation. We don't stand up in that criteria. We're too diverse. And this will probably happen to many countries in the world. So maybe the future is not about the nation state, but it's about the state with many nations within it. So it's a legal relationship that you have with the state and the society that is in a non-antagonistic relationship. I think we are pioneering in this field, and it's something that all societies, including Korea could have a look at. Thank you so much for being such a nice audience.